So there's a difference between God's providence and God's sovereignty. And sometimes we use those interchangeably, but there is actually technically a difference between God's providence and God's sovereignty. Providence is God's plan, whereas sovereignty is God's power, right? Providence is God's agenda, where sovereignty is God's action. Providence is based on God's omniscience, whereas sovereignty is based, of course, upon His omnipotence. So basically, they're the two sides of the same coin, that there's providence and there's sovereignty, and without one, there really wouldn't be the other, because if there was one, if there was providence would be futile without God's sovereignty, but if there was only sovereignty, then God's sovereignty would be flippant without God's providence. They're two sides of the same coin. We've got to have both, providence and sovereignty. And so in this chapter that we're going to be reading here today, we're looking at both of those. We're going to see both of those being played out. They are revealed in the character of Saul, who was, as the title is saying, Saul, a man lacking in quite a few things. So in these next few verses, we're going to see that Saul is lacking really in three areas of his life. And I think as we go through that text, it's going to become hopefully a little bit more clear to us and ultimately that we are not to emulate Saul, but rather Christ. So he was lacking in three ways. First is he was lacking in discipline. And then secondly, he was lacking in deliberation. And then finally, he was lacking in discernment. So he was lacking in discipline, deliberation, and discernment. So if you will, please stand for the honor of the reading of God's Word. We're only going to read the first 10 verses here this morning, but we're going to go through almost the entire chapter. I'm saving the last verse for Pastor Matt next week. So, not that he's only preaching on one verse. Verses 1 through 10 is what we're going to be reading here right now. There was a man of Benjamin whose name was Kish, the son of Abiel, son of Zeror, son of Bechorath, son of Aphiah, a Benjaminite, a man of wealth. And he had a son whose name was Saul, a handsome young man. There was not a man among the people of Israel more handsome than he. From his shoulders upward he was taller than any of the people. Now the donkeys of Kish, Saul's father, were lost. So Kish said to Saul, his son, "Take one of the young men with you, and arise, go and look for the donkeys." And he passed through the hill country of Ephraim, and passed through the land of Shalisha, and they did not find them. And they passed through the land of Shalim, but they were not there. Then they passed through the land of Benjamin, but they did not find them. When they came to the land of Zuph, Saul said to his servant who was with him, "Come, let us go back, lest my father cease to care about the donkeys and become anxious about us." But he said to him, "Behold, there is a man of God in this city, and he is a man who is held in honor, and all that he says comes true. So now let us go there. Perhaps he can tell us the way we should go." So then Saul said to his servant, But if we go, what can we bring the man? For the bread in our sacks is gone, and there is no present to bring to the man. What do we have? And the servant answered Saul, he says, "Here I have with me a quarter of a shekel of silver. And I will give it to the man of God to tell us our way." Formerly in Israel, when a man went to inquire of God, he said, "Come, let us go to the seer." For today's prophet was formerly called a seer. And Saul said to the servant, "Well said. Come, let's go." So they went to the city where the man of God was. Maybe see it. Thank you. So you may have noticed I'm not going over those 5 C's, right? The character, the conflict, the climax, the closing, and then the conclusion. I'm not going to go through those 5 C's. And the reason is because this really isn't a full narrative. I told you before when we began that really we should look at, if we can try, to look at the full narrative. The problem with that is that this would not only be the beginning of the narrative, but then Pastor Matt is going to continue it for next week. And even then after that, Bruce is going to conclude it the following week. So this is 3 weeks. So there's just way too long to be able to get everything that needs to get said. in one sermon for 3 chapters. So we're splitting it up over the next 3 weeks. So we're not going over those 5 C's this morning. In fact, we're barely even getting into that whole conflict area. Part of the conflict, though, as we see, is that Saul can't find his dad's donkeys. That's a problem. His dad, Kish, was a very wealthy man. He was a prominent Benjaminite. But in and of itself, the tribe of Benjamin was a pretty lowly tribe. And we'll see that later on. Saul even brings this up, that it's a very lowly, it's one of the least, it is the least of the tribes. It's the smallest of the tribes. But the reason that Benjamin was the smallest of the tribes, not only because Benjamin was the last born of Jacob's sons, and so he probably would have received maybe a little bit, quite a bit less than maybe the firstborn or so, but there was a huge issue in the book of Judges. If you go back to Judges and you read the book of Judges, you will see that Benjamin basically started a civil war within the 12 tribes of Israel. It started in a land called Gibeah, or sometimes it's translated as Gibeon. But there's a city of Gibeah and it's part of Benjamin. And so being that part, there's this Levite that's going through Benjamin and decides that he's going to stop in Gibeah. The people of Gibeah, the men of Gibeah, become very much like Sodom for whatever reason, and they decide that they're going to go to the man, whom he's staying with, his host. They're going to his house, they're banging on the door, demanding that the man release his Levite so that they may know him, just like the Sodomites wanted to know the 2 angels. Instead of letting the man go, instead they throw the Levite's concubine out. And the men of Gibeah rape and brutalize his concubine all through the night. And in the morning they leave her dead on the doorstep. The Levites took his concubine back home, cut her into 12 pieces, sent them throughout all the 12 tribes, and said, "This is what we will do to any tribe that does not join us in getting our revenge against the men of Gibeah." 11 of the 12 tribes met at Mizpah. Benjamin didn't go. They sent word to Benjamin and said, "Hey, Benjamin, we need you to join us. Just send out the men of Gibeah and we'll be done." And Benjamin said, "No, we aren't sending out the men of Gibeah. In fact, we will fight on the side of the Gibeahites." And there was a civil war. There at Mizpah, they declared war on Benjamin. Benjamin at first had the upper hand, but in the end, 25,000 Benjaminites were killed. Only 600 Benjaminite men were left. Only 600. So it is no wonder that they are small, that they are the least of the tribes. When Jacob blessed his children back in Genesis chapter 49, we read this. It says, Benjamin, this is anything but a blessing here. Benjamin is a ravenous wolf, in the morning devouring his prey, and at evening dividing the spoil. That was the prediction of who Benjamin would be, and that is exactly who they became, and that is who Saul was. Such would be the first king of Israel, setting up his rule in the city that caused the civil war, Gibeah. In fact, the interesting thing is, and it's going to, I think we see this next week, or maybe it's the week after that. In fact, all the people of Israel met at Mizpah, the place where they had declared war on Benjamin, to declare and to anoint Saul, a Benjaminite, to be king, who set up his reign in Gibeah, which was the city that had killed the concubine. Do you see God's hand in this? They declare war on Benjamin. They make a Benjaminite their king in the same city. It was the men of Gibeah who were guilty, and it is the city of Gibeah that Saul reigns from. We cannot dislodge what we see in 1 Samuel from what we have read in Judges, and we can't dislodge what we see in chapter 9 from what we read in chapter 8. They wanted a king. They wanted a king because they were concerned, they were worried about battles. They wanted a king just like all the other nations. God says, it's not the king that I want for you, but have your way. And he gives them the king whom no one would have thought would be the king in a million years. And everything starts with some donkeys. So let's look at verse 3 and 4 real quick just to remind ourselves. Now the donkeys of Kish, Saul's father, were lost. So Kish said to Saul, his son, take one of the young men with you and arise, go and look for the donkeys. And he passed through the hill country of Ephraim and passed through the land of Shalisha. But they did not find them. And they passed through the land of Shalem. But they were not there. And they passed through the land of Benjamin. But they did not find them. The interesting thing here is that Saul looked the part of a king, but he never really acted like a king. See, Saul came from a wealthy family. He came from Kish, who was a wealthy family. He was pretty prominent among the tribes, but among the tribe of Benjamin, but that was basically it. And he was head and shoulders, literally head and shoulders above everybody else, above the rest of the people. He was also very handsome. In fact, it says that he was the most handsome of all Israelites. So basically what we're seeing is that Saul was tall, dark, and handsome, right? He looked the part of the king. And by the way, when we look at this is not a compliment upon Saul to say that he was tall and to say that he was wealthy, because that is exactly how we see all the enemies of Israel being described. So when we see that Saul is tall and that he is wealthy and that he is handsome, we see that being said of the enemies, not of the people of Israel. When we go to David and we see how David is, David's not that way. He's short and he's ruddy. When we see even Jesus, we see that Jesus is just simply a man of no repute, comely. No one would expect him to be the Messiah. So here is Saul, and he basically is like Prince Charming in the flesh, right? And Solomon says of women, right? But this can be transferred to men, right? Charm is deceitful and beauty is vain, but a woman who fears the Lord is to be praised, right? What's good for the goose is good for the gander. A goose is a female and a gander is a male, just to let you know, right? So it's good for the goose, it's good for the gander here, right? And so here is Saul. He's charming. He's pretty, right? He's good looking, he's handsome. He's tall, but it's all vain. A king that is to be praiseworthy is to be one who is after God's own heart, who fears the Lord. And Saul was neither good nor praiseworthy. And in this part of the text, right, the donkeys have wandered away. Saul's going out to look for them. Now, either there were too many donkeys for one person to handle, or Kish, Saul's father, didn't really trust him to get the job done, because he also sends a servant. Hey, take one of the young men. I would think that it's probably the latter of the two. It's not that there are too many donkeys, because somehow the donkeys found their way back anyway, right? It's not that there are too many donkeys. Saul really couldn't be trusted with doing the job, because even after just 3 days of searching, Saul was pretty much ready to give up. The servant wanted to keep going. The servant wanted to make sure that the mission was fulfilled. The servant was willing to exhaust all measures possible. Saul, not so much. We better go back, is what Saul was saying, right? Saul, according to tradition, we saw this earlier in 1 Samuel chapter 13, depending on what translation you have. Saul was 30 years old by this time. He's 30 years old, and if he is 30 years old, that means that he is a man, right? I mean, the bar mitzvah is at 13 years old, so this is 17 years after the bar mitzvah when they're considered to be a man. So when we read these next words, it kind of sounds a little childish in verse 5. When they came to the land of Zuph, Saul said to his servant who was with him, "Come, let us go back, lest my father cease to care about the donkeys and become anxious about us." Daddy might be worried. We better go back. He's a man. He's a grown man. And we see that basically what is going on is he lacks discipline. When things get hard, he just quits. And we see that in this lacking of discipline is not just simply just the discipline, it's because he's just not mature. There's this lack of maturity in him. He couldn't be trusted to go alone because he's not going to get the job done. And like I said, maybe I'm reading too much into this, but I don't think so. Because we see this problem with Saul throughout his life. He never really grows up. Rather, instead, he really pretty much acts like an undisciplined little brat who can't keep his patience, who makes excuses for things going bad that he has done, and he throws all these temper tantrums. He has no discipline. But it's not only discipline that Saul lacks, he also is lacking a lot of deliberation. He doesn't think through things. To deliberate is to act with purpose, to act with forethought. To be able to problem solve maybe a little bit. He's not one who does that, right? He's more of a shoot first, ask questions later kind of guy, right? Shoot from the hip kind of guy. Not really giving much thought to things. He's more haphazard than anything. Again, we see this in contrast with his servant. Saul wants to go home, servant wants to stay. And finally his servant convinces him to keep looking. Verses 6 and 7. But he said to him, this is his servant, "Behold, there is a man of God in this city, and he is a man who is held in honor. All that he says comes true. So now let us go there. Perhaps he can tell us the way we should go." Then Saul said to his servant, But if we go, what can we bring the man? For the bread in our sacks is gone, and there is no present to bring to the man of God. What do we have?" Servant says, "Hey, there's a man of God here." In other words, servant wants to find Samuel. Saul, not so much. Saul doesn't even seem to even know who Samuel is. He has no idea who this Samuel is. Everybody knew Samuel. Look at me, go back just a couple of pages. Go back to chapter 3 real quick. Look at verse 20. "And all Israel from Dan to Beersheba knew that Samuel was established as a prophet of the Lord." Everybody knew it, from Dan to Beersheba. Now if you go and you look at your maps, which I happen to provide up here real quick. If you look here at the very top, you see Shiloh. That's where Samuel started from. That's where Eli was. That's where Samuel was over the tabernacle, the kind of thing, right? And then from Dan, so if you go to the left, you go west all the way to the Mediterranean Sea there, that's Dan, right? So from Shiloh all the way to Dan, all the way to Beersheba, which is right here at the very bottom here, right? All of that country knew who Samuel was. Everybody knew. Samuel was established as a prophet. People knew it. Everybody did. Somehow, we see Benjamin right underneath, right? Gibeah, same place. Not too far from Shiloh. Not too far from Mizpah, where people were declaring that we needed a king. And they all met with Samuel. Sorry, no, that was at Ramah, excuse me. But Mizpah is where they're going to declare the king, anoint the king. Everybody knew Samuel, but somehow Saul had no idea who he was. There's one time I was talking to my boss when I was working. I was operations manager at Hampton Inn. I was talking to my boss Thomas, who was the general manager of the place. We were just having this conversation. I was trying to evangelize to him a little bit, and I was like, it's like Billy Graham said. And he goes, "Who's Billy Graham?" And I laughed. I said, "You're kidding." He says, "No, I've never heard of Billy Graham." Who's never heard of Billy Graham? Who's never heard of Samuel? Saul hadn't heard of him. The tribes of Ephraim, Dan, Judah, Simeon, and Benjamin were all under Samuel's watch. But somehow Saul had missed the memo. And Saul isn't really interested in going to see Samuel. He's like, "Well, we don't have anything for Samuel." Stop and think about what's going on here, right? I mean, they've gone only 3 days. I don't know a whole lot about donkeys, though I did some research. I will save you my research. But one of the things that will often happen, especially like in the Middle East, especially in these days, they would actually have donkeys, and everybody had these donkeys. They were beast of burden, and everybody, and they would just set them out there into the pasture, and they would all have their own thing. They'd have branded so that they knew whose donkeys were, but they just kind of ate together and just had pasture together, and then sometimes they would wander off. Now, you have a donkey that wanders off. It's called a feral donkey, right? And it can go wild. So this is what they were looking for. They were looking for their feral donkeys. They had wandered off. It's not uncommon. In fact, it was fairly common that people would have to go and find their donkeys. So if it was a fairly common thing, that they would have to spend a lot of time looking for their donkeys, and they didn't bring the food or the money or the resources that they needed to find them, it just simply means that they just didn't give it much thought. Again, Saul's not the greatest deliberator. He just kind of shoots from the hip. "Hey, I need you, Saul. I need you to go. Take a servant. You guys go, and you find these donkeys. Okay, got it. Gone. Right? Where's the food? Take some food with you, Saul." They've already run out of pretty much everything. We have nothing to give to them. And the problem is that it's not like they needed anything in the first place. Charlatans took money. Men of God, the prophets, they didn't take money. Still goes today, by the way. Okay? It's the charlatans that charge for their healing services and such. But the servant is the one who at least had the wherewithal, whether or not he was using his own money, or whether or not maybe he used whatever little bit Saul had and he just kept it back because it's just some. It was the servant who was able to pull out the quarter of a shekel and say, "Hey, we've got this quarter of a shekel left. It's not much, but we've got something." He's the one that had the wherewithal to think ahead. But we even see in his reply, in Saul's reply, it's not really much seriously. "Well said. Let's go." Shooting from the hip. It was the servant who understood that he needed to seek the Lord's help. It wasn't Saul. It was the servant. The servant was more deliberate where to go and what to do. Saul, not so much. The servant seemed more intent on accomplishing the mission than Saul ever did. And brothers and sisters, we have been called by our Father to complete a task. If you want to, you can go to Ephesians chapter 2, verse 10, but there he says that we are his workmanship. Paul tells us we are his workmanship, created in Christ Jesus for good works, which God prepared beforehand. He prepared them in his providence. God prepared beforehand that we should walk in them. We are told in various places we should be serving each other with our gifts. We are told to stir one another up to love and good works. We are given a mission of ministry. We are given a mission, a commission of evangelism. And if we are honest, I don't think there would be one of us that would deny that that mission is hard. Some of us may be called to minister to our young children, or even to older ones. Some of us may be called to minister to our aging parents. Some may be called to minister to fellow church members, or to fellow employees, or to fellow students. But we're called to minister. And whatever that ministry is to which we have been called, we are to be deliberate. We are to think through it. We think through how we will go about that ministry. We are to seek the Lord's help in that ministry by His Word and through prayer and through counsel. It is absolutely easier to give up when things get tough. But we aren't called to give up. We are called to see the mission through. We are called to toil in the strength of God's might. And we can look at Jesus, and we can see that Jesus is the exact opposite of Saul, right? Jesus is given a mission. We see from just about the beginning of His ministry that He came to seek and to save that which was what? Lost. That's His mission. He made it known over and over again. Came to seek and to save that which is lost. Every word that He spoke and every action that He took, every place that He went, it was all deliberate. There are things that He would say openly because that was part of the mission, but there are things that He would say privately because that was part of the mission. Everything that He did was live to this mission. He would go certain places but not go other places because He was being deliberate about His mission. Before choosing His apostles, He sought the will of the Father, knowing that it would be these men who would carry on the mission. He knew that one of them was going to betray Him. Jesus deliberately chose Judas. He sought the Father before the cross. Not my will, but yours be done. On the cross, Father, forgive them. Into your hands I commit my spirit. And He went to be with Him after the resurrection. Everything that Jesus did on earth was deliberately done to fulfill His mission of seeking and saving the lost. May we be more like Christ than Saul. So we've seen He's not great, right? He's lacking in discipline. He's lacking in my mind went blank all of a sudden. Help me out. Deliberation. All I could think of was the next one. But he's also lacking in discipline. Discernment, excuse me. I already said that. Thank you. Good. You are on the ball, man. Discernment. Went backwards. Saul and his servant head to the city. They come across some women. They ask the women where Samuel is. Where they might find Samuel so that he can tell them where his donkeys are. And the women say that, oh, he's just gone in. He's just ahead of you guys. As soon as you walk into that gate, you should be able to find him. He's right there. Everybody's waiting on Samuel to bless the sacrifice so that they can eat. He had to go inside the city for a second. He's coming right back out. That's the implication that's coming, right? Now, real quick, you need to understand some geography. It's not going to be up here this time, but there's some geography, a little bit of Hebrew too, right? So there is Samuel, and he lives in Ramah, right? Up here in Ramah, and then there is this high place that they go and they sacrifice to God. And the word high place in Hebrew is the word Bamah, right? And so there's Ramah and there's Bamah, and they're right next to each other. So to go out of one is to go up to the next. So Samuel has just gone in to Ramah, probably to grab something, I don't know, whatever, right? But it seems the indication that the ladies are giving is that he's going to be coming right back out. So that they go into the gate, they should be able to see him right there because he's coming out. To go to Bamah, a high place, where everybody's waiting for. The 30 men of the city are waiting for him. So they go. As soon as they walk in, there's Samuel. They see him. But we see in verse 18, look with me, verse 18. Then Saul approached Samuel in the gate and said, "Tell me, where is the house of the seer?" What did the ladies just say? As soon as you walk in the gate, you'll see him. They see him, but Saul doesn't know him. And Samuel told him that he was the seer, and that Samuel had been expecting him. God had already told him the day before that he was setting up a special meeting between he and Saul, because Saul was going to be the king. He told him that he'd explain everything on Saul's mind, and that the donkeys were safe at home. And then he said something strange. Look at me, verse 20, at the end of verse 20. He says, "And for whom is all that is desirable in Israel? Is it not for you and for all your father's house?" Now, that question in the ESV may sound pretty convoluted, complex. What in the world did he just say? I think the CSB clears it up a little bit better. It says, "And who does all Israel desire but you and all your father's family?" That's his real question. Who do they want? You're the guy that Israel wants to be king. Notice that Samuel doesn't throw God's weight behind this statement, right? It's not that, well, that you are the God's chosen one to be anointed king. This is more of, this is who Israel wants to be king. Israel desires you. It isn't that God wants you to be king over Israel, as we saw last week, right? God was just basically giving Israel their wish. Now here's the thing, God is long-suffering, and he can wait until we learn our lesson. Oftentimes he is willing to wait until we learn our lesson, but typically that lesson has to be learned the hard way. And Saul was just the kind of guy that Israel wanted. Again, he was tall, dark, and handsome, just like everybody else. In fact, the name Saul, means asked for. Saul was who they were asking for. He was the one Israel had been wanting. He had king written all over him, except for his heart and mind. He looked the part, but he lacked what was necessary for the part. One can be ugly and be a good king. One can be short and be a good king. Having what it takes to be king after God's own heart is more important than having the looks to be a king after people's own minds. And that's true in all of life. That's not just true in royalty. That is true in all of life. A pastor, right, is to meet qualifications. And all but one of those qualifications is character issue. Only teaching. The pastor must be able to teach. That's the only skill he's got to have. Everything else, character issues. Humility is necessary to be used by God, right? Deacons are to meet character requirements because humility is necessary to be used by God. At least in a good way. Micah asked the question, not this Micah, the other Micah. In chapter 6, verse 8, he says, "He has told you, O man, what is good. And what does the Lord require of you but to do justice and to love kindness and to walk humbly with your God?" These are issues that go down to the root of who a person is. This is true for everybody. This is true for husbands and wives. Nowhere does it require men and women to look handsome or pretty for their spouse. But it does speak of character and how we are supposed to treat our spouse, to love and to respect, and to let the inner adornment be more important than jewelry or braided hair. Go with me real quick, Matthew chapter 23. Verse 27, Jesus gives 7 woes to the Pharisees. This is just one of them. Verses 27 28. But it gets to the point. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! For you are like whitewashed tombs, which outwardly appear beautiful, but within are full of dead people's bones and all uncleanness. So you also outwardly appear righteous to others, but within you are full of hypocrisy and lawlessness. So even the most religious-looking people can be pretenders, right? Jesus says in Matthew chapter 7 that says, on that day, many will say to me, Lord, Lord, did we not prophesy in your name and drive out demons in your name and do many miracles in your name? And then I will announce to them, I never knew you. Depart from me, you lawbreakers. They said everything right. They looked the part. There's something different inside. Many people in this world look at the various types of people, whether they're on magazines or on the internet or even this, Facebook. They present their best selves, right? The selfies, and they just they filter them, they edit them, whatever it is. They do all these different things to present their best looking self. And people will look at these photographs or look at these people maybe that's walking around the movies or what have you, and they will look at them and go, look how beautiful that person is, or look how muscular he is. Right? I mean, it's like his muscles have muscles, right? I mean, who doesn't want to look like Henry Cavill? Come on, really? Superman? Everybody wants to look like Superman, right? Am I the only one? No? Okay. He's a good-looking guy, that's all I got to say. All right? But we look at them and we go, we want to be like that. That's what we want to emulate. We want to be that beautiful, or we want to be that handsome, or we want to be that muscular, or we want to be that strong. Right? I wish I could look like that. And we get caught up in the outward appearances of a person rather than who they really are on the inside. That's why we can have that cognitive dissonance, right? Where a person can be the worst person really in the world, but they are a great actor, or they are a great musician, or a great singer, or what have you, and we will let who they really are off the hook because of who they really appear to be in person. But behind the scenes, there's somebody different. Some may not even care about that, right? They don't care about if they look like somebody else or have the muscles of somebody else or can sing like somebody else. They don't care about the outward appearance of that person. They don't really even care about how they look. Which would be fine, but at the same time, there are many of them that just don't even care how they look on the inside either. The sad part is that they give just as little attention to the inside as they do to the outside. God sees us for who we are. I mean, even Samuel gets caught up in this whole thing, right? When he goes to anoint David as the next king, and he's there and he's looking at Jesse's sons, and he comes across Eliab. If you want to, you can go there, chapter 16, verse 7. I'll just read it to you real quick. If I can get there myself. The Lord said to Samuel, do not look on his appearance or on the height of his stature, because I have rejected him. For the Lord sees not as man sees. Man looks on the outward appearance, but the Lord looks on the heart. See, Israel would look at the outward appearance. They would look at the stature. They would look at the heights and his wealth and his handsomeness, and that's who they would want. And so we go back to chapter 9, and we see that Saul responds. He says, am I not a Benjaminite? Verse 21, am I not a Benjaminite from the smallest of Israel's tribes? And isn't my clan the least important of all the clans of the Benjaminite tribe? So why have you said something like this to me? And I think that Saul understood what Samuel was saying. I think Saul understood that Samuel was saying, hey, Israel wants you to be their king. Some would say that he's being having false humility. I don't think so. I think he understands what Samuel is saying to him. His clan was the one, or his tribe was the one that started the war. He was from the city that was the main instigator. So here we have, right, basically the least important man of the least clan of the least tribe about to lead Israel. And Saul kind of gets it. And he asks, who am I to rule? Basically, that's what he's asking. Who am I to rule? Isn't that the point? Well, God would use Saul and in some way change Saul's heart. Saul was going to be king, the king that Israel wanted and the king that Israel deserved, but not the king that God desired for them. Saul, who was the people's choice, would only accomplish so much, right? Saul would kill his thousands, but David, man after God's own heart, would kill his tens of thousands, right? Saul prophesied, but we don't have any record of what really he prophesied, but we have psalm after psalm after psalm and prophecy after prophecy of what David said. They are abundant. Saul could barely keep the tribes together, but David was ultimately able to bring the tribes and unite them and expand the kingdom. Saul lost the throne, but David would have the eternal throne. So the least man from the least clan, from the least tribe, would rule Israel. And Saul understood that while he would be king, right? While he understood that he would be king, he did not understand that he was a king of God's discipline over Israel. Now, God has a way of taking people from insignificant places, right? And to bring them up for his own purposes. We see this with Jesus. Again, Micah chapter 5, verse 2. But you, Bethlehem Ephrathah, you are too little to be among the clans of Judah. From you shall come forth for me one who is to be ruler in Israel. Saul would be the scourge upon Israel. But Jesus would be the blessing for all nations. Now, at the beginning of the sermon, I mentioned providence and sovereignty. I really quickly just want to come back to that because I didn't really bring those up very much in the sermon. But I want us to go back and see God's plan, God's hand at work. Because the wandering of the donkeys, that's just not bad luck, right? That's God's movement. Donkeys wandered away, and by God's providence, he planned this encounter then with Samuel. By his sovereignty, he moved those donkeys along, not allowing for Saul and his servant to even find them. He put in the mind of Kish to send Saul, the guy who would be king, but lacking his deliberateness, but a servant who had more sense than Saul, so they may find God's prophet. By God's providence, he planned the route that the two men would take so that they ended up at Ramah just behind Samuel. By his providence, he planned on the time of day when women would get water, and by his sovereignty, had them out there on time, having seen which direction that Samuel was going. By God's sovereignty, he told Samuel that he would meet Saul in Ramah at that time, and then showed him that he would be king. Life is not a bunch of random happen chance. There's no chance. There's no luck. We say it, but it doesn't exist. There is God's providence and God's sovereignty. Solomon says in Proverbs 16:9, he says, "The heart of man plans his way, but the Lord establishes his steps." Our plans are only as good as God's will. In Proverbs 19:21, he says, "Many are the plans of the mind of men, in the mind of men, but it is the purpose of the Lord that will stand." Neither of these verses say, hey, you guys need to stop planning, you need to stop, doing your thing, right? They only mean to remind us that God's providence and God's sovereignty are supreme, and that we submit to them. It's not the other way around. That's why James says instead, right, instead of saying we're going to this town to sell and make a living, right? He says instead you ought to say if the Lord wills, we will live and do this or that. Saul was a man who was lacking in many areas of his life, and each showed a character flaw. His lack of discipline in searching for the donkeys and his immaturity there that would spring out of that. He wouldn't complete the task that was before him. He wanted to give up. The undisciplined mentality would come up with in other ways during his reign. Right? His lack of discernment, or his lack of deliberation was an issue. He didn't think things through. We see this later on again when he says, hey, nobody can eat until we finish this battle, right? Until we win the war, nobody eats. How dumb is that, right? But that was what he said. He didn't think things through. He didn't act like a man on a mission. He lacked discernment, not knowing who Samuel was or why he would be the king. And through it all, God sovereignly carried out his providential plan. And then in contrast, we see Jesus, who carried out the very mission that God had sent him on, to seek and to save those who are, what's the word? Lost. Every step of the way. And Jesus is just as deliberate now as he was then. He is just as deliberate with your continued holiness and transformation as he was with Peter and James and John and the rest. As Paul would say, I am sure of this, that he who began a good work in you will bring it to its completion at the day of Jesus Christ. So let us grow then in our discipline, in our deliberation, and in our discernment so that we may be more like Christ and further from Saul. Let's pray.